In the world, there are many people ready to help others and sincerely wanting to contribute to improving lives. Those who have gone through difficulties and trials themselves, which others are now trying to overcome, are the most effective in such situations. However, not everyone needs or accepts help. When faced with a problematic personality and making every effort to help them, one can inadvertently cause enormous, even fatal harm, but as this story demonstrates, primarily to oneself. Tammie Apperson was an attractive woman who had worked in the modeling business for a long time. She left this field a few years before the events described. The reason for ending her career was addiction to living her entire life in the disadvantaged area of Los Angeles, Skid Row. She couldn't resist the temptations. As a result, by the age of 30, she found herself in the grip of drug addiction. Fortunately, the heroine realized her situation and didn't want to put up with it, so she decided to undergo a rehabilitation program. By 2000, when she turned 38, she managed to radically change her life. Despite a long struggle with the pernicious addiction, she took advantage of the second chance given to her. At the time of the events in question, those who couldn't pull themselves together and break the vicious circle were able to completely overcome the destructive habits. Tammie started a new life and decided to help others so that they too could have the opportunity to achieve the same and steer their existence in a normal direction. She lived in the Burlington Plaza apartment complex, created with state support. It was built as a shelter for people who wanted to get another chance. Here, those who had just begun the fight against bad habits, as well as those who had already managed to overcome them, found refuge. For many, the complex became a real fortress that separated them from the thriving crime outside its walls. The territory was fenced and under round-the-clock security, and each visitor had to leave their signature in a special log book upon entry and exit. Unfortunately, all these security measures were not enough for the heroine of the story. She lived in a small studio on the first floor, but some criminal attacked her right inside the building. It was a brutal crime, a striking example of excessive violence, shocking even for Skid Row. When police detectives arrived at the building around 9 p.m. on November 13, 2000, they saw walls and floors covered in blood. The perpetrator showed such cruelty that blood was literally everywhere, even on the ceiling. For many police officers, this case became the most vivid manifestation of human cruelty, which was etched in their memory for the rest of their lives. At the crime scene, investigators found real ruins. In the small 10 by 12 meter apartment, everything that could be broken was destroyed. Furniture, glass and ceramic objects, household appliances, everything was smashed to pieces and scattered on the floor. All these things were also covered in blood. Tammie's personal belongings were strewn across the bed, as if the perpetrator was looking for something specific. Police officers suggested that he might have committed the attack in search of money or The victim of the massacre herself was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. She was partially naked, her underwear pulled down, and her face horribly mutilated. There were cuts and tears on the inner thighs and in the groin area. Investigators speculated that she could have been a victim, given the position of the body, the injuries, and the partially removed clothing. From the first seconds at the crime scene, the officers were gripped by horror. Some of the forensic experts working in the building couldn't withstand the gruesome scene. Blood was everywhere, and the condition of the body was terrible. Due to the small area of the room and the incredible cruelty of the attacker, blood droplets covered absolutely all surfaces. According to police testimony, the criminal attacked the 38-year-old woman and slammed her against the wall several times. She immediately suffered serious injuries that caused disorientation or even loss of consciousness. Unfortunately, the criminal thought it wasn't enough. He beat her for a long time when Tammie was already lying on the floor. Moreover, the perpetrator used everything that came to hand. It was obvious that such a brutal massacre took a long time. First, the unknown person dealt with the apartment's resident in the cruelest way, and then methodically searched everything, scattering and smashing everything around. It was clear that this must have created a lot of noise, but none of the neighbors reported it to the police during the attack. In the opinion of the detectives, the degree of decomposition of the body indicated that the victim had died at least a day before the police arrived. Despite this, all the neighbors claimed they hadn't heard anything. This was an obvious lie, since the apartments didn't have proper soundproofing, and the scale of destruction was such that it was simply impossible to do it without noise. In fact, it was the victim's close friend who contacted the police. He himself didn't know what could have happened to her, but he couldn't reach the woman for several hours, so he suspected something was wrong. Eventually, he learned from third parties that Tammie was probably dead. When he contacted the police, it turned out that law enforcement had no information about this incident. But the man's words interested the dispatchers, and they decided to send patrol officers to check if everything was all right in the missing woman's apartment. Even a superficial examination of the body demonstrated an extremely high level of cruelty shown by the attacker. He clearly had serious reasons for such aggression or long-standing rage, because he dealt with Tammie with inhuman cruelty. Her once attractive face was disfigured beyond recognition. One of the woman's eyes turned out to be gouged out. The throat was repeatedly cut with glass shards. The victim received at least 3 blows to the face. The probable weapon for inflicting these injuries was a large screwdriver. The police found it right there, under the victim's shoulder. The holes were deep and round, so the forensic experts concluded that this object was used to commit the crime. One of the detectives immediately suggested that the motive for the attack could be the woman's beauty. Tammie was indeed very attractive. It seemed that someone wanted to destroy her beauty. Unfortunately, the criminal succeeded in this. All the blows were concentrated on the victim's face and neck. These were deep stab wounds, cuts that deprived her of any chance of surviving the brutal attack. A special expert, a specialist in the analysis of blood spatter, was called to the scene of the terrible tragedy. In this situation, he could analyze the eerie scene in the apartment and recreate the events as accurately as possible. It took him 7 hours of work just in the victim's apartment to collect all the data and form a complete picture of the crime scene. After that, several more hours of continuous analysis were needed to record, process and systematize all the data. A large number of blood stains were found in the bathroom. The body, however, was in the living room. She was probably attacked at the very moment when she was in the bathroom. Several bloody traces were found that could have been left if the woman's bloodied back of the head was pressed against the wall. Several similar stains were found at different heights. It seemed that Tammie was being strangled by someone strong, trying to lift her off the floor. In addition, at the time of the attack, the bathroom door was closed, as evidenced by the blood drops on their inner side. A trail of blood drops led from the bathroom to the living room. It appeared that the perpetrator carried the victim's body to the living room in his arms so that her legs were hanging down. After that, Tammie was laid on the floor and the torture continued. Obviously, it was at this moment that she received those deep blows with a screwdriver, as well as cuts on the throat, which ultimately led to her death. The forensic experts had an incredible amount of work to do, as the attacker used several murder weapons at once. He beat his victim not only with a screwdriver, inflicting blows to the face, but also cut her throat with glass fragments from the coffee table. Several pieces of furniture, in particular a wooden chair leg, looked suspicious. All this was generously covered in blood, thrown at the crime scene, and therefore could contain valuable evidence and DNA materials that would help identify the brutal killer. All materials were collected and sent to the laboratory for detailed analysis. It was assumed that the criminal could not have avoided injuring himself during such an execution, so the forensic experts hoped to find his blood as well. Among the household items used by the attacker was a poof, an interior element that they couldn't even identify at the initial stages of the investigation. It was literally smashed to small splinters, but all covered in blood. A similar condition had an unrecognized glass product, which the detectives initially mistook for a lighting lamp, but in the laboratory it was found out that it was actually a massive, thick-walled flower vase. The decorative object was broken into several parts, each of which had a large number of blood stains. The fragments of these objects looked as if they were used to cut the victim's throat and beat her. Forensic experts assumed that the criminal was breaking all these things on his victim while she was lying unconscious in the center of the room. This beast took item after item and beat Tammie until the thing was completely destroyed, after which he took the next one and continued the execution. The most striking thing was that the inevitable loud noise was completely ignored by the residents of the complex. The forensic experts managed to establish that the criminal consistently smashed a candlestick in the bathroom, then a poof, a vase, and finally used a lamp, on which the most traces of blood were found. During a thorough inspection of the victim's small apartment, police officers found several important pieces of evidence. A blood-soaked rag was lying in the bathroom sink. It probably contained traces of the attacker's blood. It later turned out that it had Tammie's DNA on it, which meant that the killer was trying to cover up traces of the crime by wiping away the blood. But he obviously abandoned this idea when he realized the scale of what he had done and understood that it could take days. Clearly, he just left everything and ran away. There was also a bottle of water with a red fingerprint on the surface. A large number of paper towels with similar traces were found in the trash can. In addition to the brutal massacre, Tammie was as her underwear and clothes remained pulled down. These suspicions were confirmed by the medical examiner. At the same time, traces of blood were found on the parts of the victim's body, indicating that contact with the attacker occurred after the beating. Forensic experts took a swab from the wall to obtain the DNA of the probable killer. Given the nature of the attack, police officers immediately began searching for enemies among the victim's closest circle. In her apartment, they found several items that she clearly considered valuable and put in a frame. However, there were no family members, friends, or men here. These were photographs from her modeling activities, a certificate of education, as well as confirmation of completing an addiction treatment program. Obviously, the victim was very proud of all these things. It was a neat apartment, clean and tidy, which the woman kept in order, decorating it with angels and flowers. It didn't resemble the typical dwelling of a person suffering from addiction or close to the criminal world. By all indications, including the words of the woman's acquaintances, Tammie had indeed overcome her bad habits and was leading a normal life. However, there were still many suspicious individuals in her circle, especially those who had problems with addiction. A few years before these events, Tammie herself was in a brutal criminal environment. The heroine of the story managed not only to overcome the craving for prohibited substances, but also found a fairly decent job. The woman got a job as an office manager at a Hollywood telephone service that served celebrities. In addition, she got involved in volunteer work. The church, located near the complex, offered her to counsel people who had problems with addiction. She agreed, as she saw in this activity an opportunity to help those in need. Given that the attacker wanted to destroy her beauty, as well as the fact that it was a very attractive woman, police officers suggested that the perpetrator could be a rejected lover or a secret admirer who never received a response from Tammie. Almost immediately, the detectives got a lead on the likely perpetrator. One of the residents of the complex, who wished to remain anonymous, told about the possible killer. The first suspect was named Ronald Sims, whom everyone called Ron. The man also had a long history of addiction to hard which he continued to struggle with. In addition, he had dated Tammie for some time. Their relationship ended when the woman was able to overcome her craving, and he never found the strength to break the vicious circle. However, they continued to communicate regularly and maintained a friendly relationship. The woman was sure that he needed her help, so she actually counseled him and helped him by her own example. The police immediately contacted Ron, as he turned out to be a possible candidate for the role of the killer. However, he refused to admit guilt. He said that he maintained purely friendly relations, they didn't quarrel, and he would never be able to hurt her. The man shared a more sinister story. According to him, he maintained a relationship with Tammie not only in the hope of ending his problems, but also to provide her with protection. The fact is that during the counseling sessions that she conducted in the church, the heroine of the story met a suspicious man. He became a real stalker, so Ron backed her up. This man's name was Troy Powell. At the time of Tammie's death, he was 32 years old, but the suspect was on probation after another imprisonment. It turned out that the three of them were friends, communicated in the same company, attended church together, but it always felt like Troy was in love with Tammie. From the first acquaintance, he began to meet the mentor after work, give her flowers and teddy bears. He waited for her in his pickup truck almost every day and offered to give her a ride. During this period, a bus driver's strike was going on in the city, so Tammie sometimes agreed to this offer, although she usually rode with others. Troy suffered from addiction. The deceased considered him potentially dangerous, so she rarely rode with him. She didn't confess to her ex-boyfriend Ron that she used Troy's help only in exceptional cases. It was still less risky than walking the streets of one of the most dangerous areas of the city. The man misinterpreted her consent to give her a ride. Troy was convinced that he had a chance. In fact, Tammie was not only forced to use his help, but also wanted to help the man cope with his problems. She gave him advice, supported him, but kept her distance and didn't want any romantic relationship. The woman repeatedly directly stated this to her admirer, but he became more and more persistent. Recently, his obsession with Tammie began to manifest itself more and more vividly, and the woman tried not to cross paths with him. Tammie's loved ones believed that he was involved in the woman's murder. Troy was quick-tempered and aggressive, as well as obsessed with her. A chilling find was discovered in the victim's apartment, a telephone address book. In it, the deceased kept a record of all the calls of this suspicious person. There were many notes here indicating what time Troy called, how long the conversation lasted. Tammie also noted how it ended, whether there were threats or something similar. Mostly she ended such conversations with a request not to bother her with calls anymore. However, he contacted her again the same day. This went on for quite a long time. Soon, one of the suspect's acquaintances told Ron that Troy had confessed to him about the murder. After that, Ron called the police and reported it. According to the witness, Troy told him that he came to visit Tammie, they had a nice chat, had and then quarreled, and in a fit of anger, he killed the woman. Despite the eloquent story, the police officers were not sure that he was telling the whole truth. He was detained and taken to the police station until the circumstances were clarified. He was also still on the list of suspects, as he was a criminal. Ron had a conviction for theft, even a motive for reprisal, which could be jealousy of an ex-girlfriend. But later the man was released. Meanwhile, they couldn't find Troy. He got lost in a city with a population of 4 million people and could have fled, as he got a head start of several hours. The records of the log book of the complex where the deceased lived were checked. It turned out that Troy did indeed go inside on the day of the murder, and left only a few hours later. When the probable killer was leaving, he was asked about Tammie, because leaving without the accompaniment of residents was prohibited. Then the criminal answered with a smile that the woman was resting. They believed him and let him go. He was the last one who visited the apartment of the deceased, which further increased the suspicions about him. On the same day, according to Ron, he had planned work with Tammie in the church. He called her, but Tammie never answered. And this seemed strange, because she was always willing to talk on the phone. The church reported that the woman did not come. The next morning, Ron went to her work, but Tammie wasn't there either. The man couldn't get into the territory of the residential complex, as at this time he broke down again and started using the substance. They simply didn't let him into his friend's apartment, but he saw that Troy's red pickup truck was parked on the street near the house, which caused him concern. He kept calling her persistently, but Tammie never picked up the phone, so he contacted the police. The detectives were reconstructing the picture of the fatal day and came to the conclusion that on the eve of the murder, after the church, Tammie was picked up by her stalker. They went to the store and bought a Bible, which the woman gave to Troy. She believed that he was on the path to correction. Obviously, the man was able to arrange under some pretext for her to let him come visit. According to Tammie's close friends, she wasn't going to give Troy a chance, but she was always a little naive, so he could simply convince her that he wanted help, advice in connection with his addiction. The woman put her heart and soul into this activity, sincerely believing that she was making the world a little better, and probably couldn't refuse. That's how he got into the house. Unfortunately, she trusted her environment too much, which was far from ideal. When the detectives checked Troy Powell's criminal past, it turned out that he had a long history of offenses, including serious crimes. These included the use and distribution of burglary, and he served a sentence for attacking another woman he was also stalking. That woman miraculously survived his attack. The man was clearly a danger to society, especially to females. At the same time, he had a very masculine appearance, was muscular and tall, a cool guy, which attracted the attention of girls. The police sent out an alert to find this person's vehicle, a red pickup truck. It was described in detail by Ron, as he had repeatedly seen the car in which the probable killer met Tammie. The very next day after the detectives arrived at the scene of the massacre, the investigators got a lead. It turned out that Troy was seen at a friend's house in San Pedro, about 30 kilometers from the complex. Obviously, he was hiding from another person who also turned out to be on parole. Police officers were sent to this address. They managed to find out that Troy had left his pickup truck and left about 45 minutes ago. Given the fact that the suspect was not using his car, he could simply get lost in the crowd of the city. However, the very next morning, luck smiled upon the police officers. The pickup truck was taken at night. Fortunately, one of the patrol officers, who regularly checked the hotel for parolees, found an unfamiliar car in the parking lot that same morning, which turned out to be a noticeable red pickup truck. The officer checked the license plate and found out that the vehicle belonged to the wanted trio. The detectives were informed and arrived at the scene, intending to detain the main suspect. The police waited outside the building until the killer picked up his car. The driver was detained. He was a stocky tall man. The most suspicious fact was his baseball cap, on which the investigators found drops of blood. However, the detainee insisted that his name was Charles Vanoy. After checking the documents, they were able to make sure that he was telling the truth. In any case, it was decided to detain the man and analyze the red stain on his headgear. He told the story that his friend Troy had given him the car the day before and picked it up at night along with a jacket, a camera, and other things. In fact, the two were former cellmates, so they kept in touch even after being released from prison. The police immediately searched the hotel room. Here, inside the camera, they managed to find a film, and after developing it, several images appeared showing Tammie, Charles, and Troy. According to Charles, they all met in church, where Tammie helped people rehabilitate after problems with. Unfortunately, the DNA tests took much longer, but in the end, it was established that the blood on the baseball cap did not belong to the victim of the massacre. It was decided to interrogate Charles, and after some time he admitted that he possessed valuable information but was ready to share it in exchange for protection from persecution. The police agreed, and according to the criminal, Troy confessed to the massacre of his secret love, from whom he could never get reciprocity. He gave him the pickup truck and was going to hide from the police. At the same time, his cellmate claimed that the killer did not rule out the possibility of voluntarily surrendering to the police. Charles Vanoy insisted that he had nothing to do with the massacre, but during the interrogation, he provided information that only the perpetrator or a witness could clearly know. The man was aware that Tammie's throat was cut and she was hit several times in the face with a screwdriver. However, it remained unclear whether his former cellmate had told him these details or whether he himself was present at the scene of the massacre. Thus, Charles was forced to cooperate with the investigation, so he informed the detectives that Troy was supposed to call him at 7 p.m. that same day. The man agreed to help the police officers to catch the killer. The friends contacted each other by phone. At that moment, the police managed to establish the address where the criminal was located. He was detained while watching an adult movie in a hotel. Right there, Tammie's keys to her office were found. As it turned out, he was planning to rob it. His DNA was found on the body of the deceased after his numerous bloody fingerprints were found on many objects. And the victim's blood was on his clothes. Therefore, there was no doubt left that it was Troy who was behind the crime. According to Troy, he did indeed kill Tammie. However, he was in an insane state. The criminal said that he suffered from mental disorders. And during this period, he had not been taking prescribed medications for a long time, as he had no money to buy them. According to his claims, he came to visit his beloved woman. Here they had relations by mutual consent, because they were dating. However, later another man called her, and this made him very angry. Tammie refused to discuss this call with Troy and just went to the bathroom. He followed her, closed the door, and dealt several blows with his fist to her head. According to the suspect, he remembered nothing after that. By this time, some of the analyses of the collected evidence had been completed. It turned out that all the fingerprints belonged to the detainee. At this stage, the forensic experts suspected that this attack was something more than just beating. It was assumed that he tortured his victim. The killer was charged with premeditated murder associated with breaking and entering, and torture. Collectively, all this gave good reason for the prosecution to demand the death penalty. However, Troy was not going to give up without a fight. He claimed that he had been struggling with a mental disorder all his life, because of which he could not stand trial. In the end, the hearing had to be postponed due to a psychiatric examination. According to its results, it was proven that the criminal did not lose the ability to be aware of his actions during the attack. He described the sequence of events in sufficient detail to his friend Charles, who became one of the key prosecution witnesses. Troy himself cited childhood trauma as the reason for the attack. According to the defendant, he suffered from the cruelty of his alcoholic father throughout his childhood. All this resulted in deviations, because of which he could not stand a woman's rejection and instantly fell into a rage, losing control of himself. All this was confirmed by psychiatrists. One of the key stages of the hearing was Troy's testimony for the defense. Usually, such episodes do more harm to the accused, but he was well versed in the judicial system, so his words sounded quite consistent. He admitted that he could be the killer but claimed that he didn't remember anything. At the same time, the defendant believed that the woman was still alive when he left the apartment, so, in his opinion, the murder was unintentional. Troy also denied any problems with the opposite, which his psychiatrist talked about. His mother and two sisters spoke on the side of the accused. In fact, they all had stories about how Troy's attacks led to serious injuries. He even broke his own mother's spine, pushed his sister down the stairs a few years before these events. And then he insisted that he had a memory lapse. However, relatives continued to claim that he was a good person and was not capable of a brutal massacre. The testimony of forensic experts indicated the opposite. One of the prosecutor's most terrifying claims was that he tortured his victim for a long time before her death. Forensic experts found torn wounds in Tammie's groin. According to the experts, these were the most horrific mutilations they had seen in their entire careers. They spoke of the victim being brutally beaten, not of relations by mutual consent. The jury decided that Troy Powell was guilty on all charges, and he was sentenced to death. He is currently awaiting execution in the death row cell at San Quentin Prison.